Good afternoon and welcome to our second session on energy resilience. My name is Julie Raymond and I work for the Social Investment Business. I'd like to introduce my colleagues Robin Bell and Steve Cole from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. This afternoon's session will provide an overview of SIB and our Energy Resilience Fund. I'll then pass over to Robin and Steve, who will explain how the different types of buildings can affect energy performance and what this can mean when considering energy efficiency improvements. It should help you start thinking about the opportunities and challenges within your own buildings, and of course, how those can be funded through our Energy Resilience Fund. So a little bit of housekeeping. During the session, there will be a live Q&A box, which should be at the bottom in your toolbar. So if you do have any questions, please do post them into that box, and our team will do our best to answer them as we go along, or they will be answered at the end. Slides will be sent out after the session, probably early next week, and there will also be a handout that will accompany this, and the recording will be shown on our website. So to start with, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the social investment business. So we work with charities and social enterprises across the UK. We provide a mix of loans, grants and support, and have deployed and managed over £8 million since 2002 and supported over 6,000 organisations across the UK. We started working with the Centre for Sustainable Energy around 12 months ago, and they're a key partner on our Energy Resilience Fund, providing support and advice to applicants throughout the process. So what is our Energy Resilience Fund? It was launched about a year ago and is the successor to a pilot scheme which was run by Key Fund. It's a fund for organisations based in England and is there to support you to become more energy resilient through property improvements or equipment and more efficient vehicles. It's a £15 million blended fund, so every successful applicant will receive 60% loan, 40% grant. And we work with a range of partners, and this next slide shows you who they are. So if you choose to apply to the fund, you can pick any of those partners to work with. In terms of what can be funded, this slide can give you an idea of what we can fund. Essentially, it's any improvement that makes your organisation more energy resilient. Our website has further details on what is eligible and also some case studies on what we have funded so far. And we've had a huge variety of energy improvements and vehicles, including electric showers, solar panels, minibuses, and even an electric tractor. So key terms of the fund are that the minimum request is £25,000 and the maximum is £250,000. You can apply for multiple sites or multiple measures, but the maximum available to any one organisation is £250,000. The loan term is between 2 to 10 years, and we can offer an interest-only repayments in the first year. It will be unsecured, and there are no early repayment fees throughout the lifetime of the loan. If you are interested, our eligibility criteria is all on our website, and this slide just shows you those key points. So key things to take away from this are that you need to have been operating for at least 2 years and had a turnover of £100,000 or more in your last annual accounts. If you are looking to make property improvements and you lease the property rather than own it, you will need to have a minimum of 12 years remaining on the lease. If you're close to that 12 years, please do let us know and we can have a separate discussion about that. If you decided to apply, everything you need to know is on our website. We've got a huge range of guidance and advice to help you. And again, you can choose which partner to work with. So it might be whoever fits best with your organisation or somebody you have an existing relationship with. If you are applying for property improvements, you will need an energy audit that's been completed within the last 2 years. If you don't have an audit, we can pay for one on your behalf. But just the point about those audits is that they're not a standalone part of the fund, so you can't apply just for an audit. The audits themselves are carried out by one of our 3 providers, and they will visit your site to see which measures will work for you in your building. The report produced by each of the auditors is standardised in terms of the information it provides, so it doesn't matter which auditor you are allocated. Just for that, if you are applying for equipment, you won't need an audit, but you will need 3 quotes for any item over £10,000. Once you have decided what your application and what you wish to go ahead with, we can support you through that. That'll be through the auditor, your relationship manager who will be working on your assessment, and also through up to 2-day support from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. And as it says there, You will be supported throughout the life of your investment, not just the assessment stage, but also once you start repaying anything through a dedicated relationship manager at Social Investment Business. So I hope that's given you a bit of background to the fund and what it can be used for. And I'm now going to pass over to Robin and Steve to talk about how your building can impact your energy use.
Thanks, Julie. Just to check you can see my screen okay.
Yes, fine.
Great. Hi. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. So myself and Steve, my colleague, to take you through the next sort of 30 to 40 minutes on some information about the kind of types of buildings and things to think about when thinking about energy efficiency measures. All right. So for anyone who doesn't know, just a quick intro as to who we are. We are an energy-based charity, energy charity based in Bristol. We have a few different sort of core work streams. Principally, we're focused on ending the suffering caused by cold homes and combating the climate crisis. And we do a lot of work supporting people in fuel poverty. We have an advice line and a retrofit team. And also we support community organisations on energy, fuel poverty, retrofit. We also work with local and central government on decarbonisation and energy plans. And as part of this support for SIB, we're supporting the application process for the Energy Resilience Fund with any sort of technical buildings advice. So just to give you a quick sense of what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at the types of community buildings and some possible measures, the unique factors that affect your building individually. We'll touch on sort of payback periods, and also we'll just finish off talking about how you go about finding contractors and the kind of things you need to think about when looking at tradespeople.
Okay, so it's often sort of said that the most sustainable building is one that already exists. So where possible, we need to be thinking about retaining old buildings and improving them, as this is often better for the environment than demolition and building new. So it's often sort of said 80% of buildings we have in 2050 are already built today. For those of you with older buildings, we also need to be looking at protecting and preserving our heritage for future generations. And we also need to keep in mind the embodied carbon of any of the improvements we're thinking of making. So this is not just about operational carbon, it's the embodied carbon as well. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
So just to set the scene, and one of the key things you've probably heard about many times, the UK's key piece of climate policy is the Climate Change Act, which was originated in 2008 and amended in 2019. So it commits the UK government by law to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 100% of 1990 levels by 2050. So it's quite a big ask. But I suppose the point here is, how does this all kind of affect us? And there's some very sort of simple points that we just try to take away from this. And obviously there's lots of other circumstantial factors and if you like, unpredictability in energy markets, and all these things affect energy prices, as well as obviously policy and targets from government. So we're generally heading in a direction where we're looking really to reduce our energy demand. We're looking to make energy use a lot smarter and to decarbonize our heating, which is the principal use for energy in most of our buildings. So this essentially and predominantly means the electrification of heating. So this is sort of one of the main thrusts, alongside fabric measures, introducing things like insulation and air tightness and draft proofing to our buildings, but also the electrification, where possible, of our heating, and also hot water use, to try and shift away from the heavy sort of carbon footprint that we have from gas use. So principally, we want to think about possible measures to reduce demand before we get into adding any sort of technology to our buildings. And this is where we have to think in quite some detail about the kind of buildings we have and what specific measures might be sort of relevant to those buildings.
So, as I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of, community buildings come in all different shapes and sizes, and they are used for a wide variety of different things. So, the picture you're looking at on the left there I think it's a grade 2-star listed former church. It's now not a church anymore. It's a community arts venue. They do lots of live music performances. And have lots of sort of different educational sessions. So yeah, whilst it might have been built as a church and been used as a church for a long time, it's now used for very, very different things. And the picture on the right there is a bit of a screen grab from another community centre, just to sort of talk about the challenges that community building managers can often face, and that's juggling different sorts of activities in different spaces at different times, and how that can really be quite tricky when it comes to setting things like heating schedules and such like.
So I suppose the first thing to just build on that is to say that there's huge diversity in the types of buildings that we all occupy and use for various different functions. So, there's diversity in the building type, its age, its location, its setting, its function, the services that are provided within that, and the users of those services, how it's set up. Is it voluntary or with paid staff? The capacity of those staff, and also the tenure of the building. Julie mentioned a criteria is the sort of leasehold or ownership of the building in this sort of fund application process. So just as a sort of illustration here in these pictures, you've got a building which provides a sort of care setting. You've got another one, bottom right, which is a music venue. On the right-hand side, there's a cinema and arts centre. So many different functions and different uses. And this will all sort of shape the kind of measures that will be relevant to your building and the payback periods, and how the building is used, and the kind of decisions you make as you go through this journey.
So yeah, just I suppose talking more to that diversity. Robin's already mentioned different shapes and sizes, different uses, but that it can often sort of impact the advice that we can give. But there's also different things to think about. So we've already seen the picture in the top left there. That's used for music venues at night time. So one of their biggest challenges is actually not actually heating, it's actually ventilation provision is something that they struggle with. The top picture there in the middle, that was a community sort of charitably run care home for young children. They had solar panels on their roof, but what they didn't know was their solar panels weren't actually connected to anything. We do have different bits and considerations. I think the picture on the right there is a bit more of an all-purpose community centre with lots of different challenges, and it does mean that I guess the advice for them has to be bespoke to them. The picture on the bottom right, that was a tennis club that I think we looked at. And that was quite an interesting one because they don't actually have any heating and have very little hot water provision, and they had an asbestos roof. So what they were able to do was sort of limited by the specifics of the building. So yeah, that's just a bit of an insight into different considerations, means that different things are relevant and appropriate for different buildings.
So again, just a bit more about understanding the difference here. This is essentially what you can see from the picture. It's an indoor tennis court. The building is a sort of steel frame construction with infill panels. So the kind of requirements for this will be very different from something which provides a sort of care setting or a meeting venue or something that might provide overnight accommodation. Here, it's probably mostly about maybe a little bit of low-level heating in the winter, but perhaps predominantly about ventilation, because people are going to get quite hot, particularly in the summer. There could be some overheating issues, as there's nothing really other than a very thin roof to protect people from the heat being gained by the building. So it could be that they would be interested in solar panels to cover their lighting. This is probably one of the largest expenses. So it's about really just thinking about what is specific to your building and its use, and also its construction type. This one, again, very different construction type, a relatively modern construction, not massively attractive, has large areas of glazing, a flat roof. So again, thinking about, well, could the windows be upgraded in some form, perhaps secondary glazing or a more efficient double glazing? Would the roof be suitable for solar panels? Is there opportunities to improve the fabric with any kind of insulation? It could be a cavity wall construction, so whether cavity wall insulation or internal insulation may be relevant. And then also thinking about draft proofing and ventilation requirements. So again, another different type of building, a place of worship, which has its own set of requirements. Huge, very beautiful building, huge high ceilings, almost impossible to heat efficiently. So there's other things here to think about. How can you heat the people rather than the space, and make it warm and comfortable for the sort of limited time it's used? And then another old sort of premises here, very similar to the sort of top middle one. Again, it's something with a flat roof, a relatively modern construction, has some outside space for parking. But again, there's opportunities here that, maybe solar panels to the roof. And it looks like the front section of the building is, relatively sort of perhaps a temporary construction. So could that be upgraded and the efficiency improved? So there's different things to think about. And then this one here, a more modern construction, most definitely probably a cavity wall construction. So whether the cavities could be insulated, probably relatively airtight and draft proof already. So again, there's a good amount of roof space. So could solar panels be fitted here? Possibly. A heat pump of some kind would be relevant. It may already have, sort of gas central heating system. So a switch to an air source heat pump, for example, could be relatively straightforward, providing the sort of pipe work and the radiators and things are thoroughly assessed, and any work done there to sort of upgrade the system, as well as obviously fitting the heat pump itself.
So yeah, we've already, I guess, touched on places of worship, but I guess there's lots of places of worship that still are places of worship that are used for things other than just worship. But as I mentioned previously, there are lots of former places of worship that are now used for different things entirely. So it can be quite challenging sometimes. I think one of the biggest questions is how often the space is used, because that's really going to influence any sort of recommendations around heating. And it's not just how often the space is used, but we need to be thinking about things like conservation heating and background heating and sort of different approaches to heating that might be appropriate. Occupant comfort, Robin mentioned earlier about heating the people. It's quite difficult to heat some of these spaces. So there's different things you can do in churches. I've come across under pew heating. There's I've even seen little rechargeable heated cushions that people use. So it's just trying to think a bit outside the box sometimes. Insulating building fabrics such as this can be quite a challenge, not least because of lots of the nice historical details and interests and heritage value of some of these buildings. And things like the windows, we might have some nice stained glass windows that we might need to take care of. We're unlikely going to be ripping them out to put in plastic double glazing. And there are then additional challenges with looking at things like solar panels.
So a completely different type of building, and there's many of these around the country, former industrial sites and premises, which can be huge buildings in themselves and can be divided up for various different organizations and businesses using different parts of the space. So sort of key things to think about here is to understand the range of different people using the building, and just try and engage with those people and understand, what kind of environment they're looking for, and how you can improve that environment if it needs to be improved. Possibly one of the ways of doing that is through sort of different controls, intelligent controls. So maybe a building management system might be relevant, potentially to isolate sort of unused spaces, and to heat and zone different parts of the building at different times of day and for different uses at different temperatures. Can be a good efficient way of reducing your energy costs. Some of these buildings have large roof spaces and large voids, so maybe insulating the roof spaces and the roof voids could be an option, and sort of loft roof insulation is perhaps one of the best and one of sort of the first kind of go-to places if you're looking at insulating the fabric, because obviously heat rises, so it's one of the places that loses one of the most amount of heat goes out the roof. Other things to think about is perhaps the external walls and the ground floor. Can those be insulated internally? Some of these buildings may have some sort of historical or heritage significance, so there may be restrictions on work that you can do to the outside. Another aspect is, of course, the windows. These can be quite a significant feature for industrial sort of heritage properties, but they can take up a large area of the elevation, and do contribute to quite a bit of heat loss. So maybe these could be upgraded with maybe secondary glazing or sensitive sort of double glazing, if that's possible. And then, of course, heat pumps might be relevant if there's large roof spaces or outside space where something that could be sited. But the design and installation, that needs sort of expert advice from a heat pump engineer. And then, of course, solar panels. Again, the large roof spaces could be used for solar installations. So it might be relevant in some situations, but of course, there's thought needs to be given to any sort of negative impacts, and if there's the installation might have on the historical fabric or on the surrounding area. And then, of course, these buildings weren't necessarily designed to be occupied in quite the same way as they might be now. So there could be issues where there's large areas of glass and they're poorly insulated. So overheating could be a factor. So think about things like external shutters or internal shutters that can reduce the solar gain in the summertime.
And this brings us on to, I guess, more modern buildings. I think it's important to sort of keep in mind that there's been a bit of an evolution over time. So there isn't necessarily a strict cutoff point for what you would maybe classify as a modern building. The way that we've changed and designed buildings is definitely altered over the years. So if we are looking at modern buildings, we do need to go through lots of the sort of similar considerations. Occupant comfort, do we have efficient services? Let's not assume that, there's lots of newer buildings now that are still going to be needed to be retrofitted because they still have fossil fuel heating, and things like that. So there's definitely work that still needs to be done even on more modern buildings. Things like windows might be a thing. Plastic windows tend to have a limited lifespan. So it might be a case if you've got a building that's sort of 20 years old, 30 years old, it might come to a stage now where you're looking at things like windows. I've mentioned things like heat pumps. So if we are trying to electrify heating with more efficient systems, then we're going to need to looking at things like heat pumps. Solar panels are not a sort of given on new buildings. They might be in the future, but they're certainly not at the moment. So we also need to be thinking about that. And overheating is generally a consideration that I guess historically has been overlooked. So we're trying to encourage people to think about overheating more as that becomes more of an issue with our changing climate.
So that just sort of rounds off a quick whistle stop of the different types of buildings. So we're just going to talk now a little bit about the kind of factors which are unique to your own building. And we have touched on this in the previous webinar, and there's lots of advice on our website, but every building performs differently. according to its location and its orientation, how it's designed, what was originally designed to be used, how it's constructed, the services that are installed, the use pattern and its current condition. Is it well maintained? So kind of illustrate the point, the image, the photograph on the sort of left center of the white building in the Highland landscape is designed for its location. It's in the northwest of Scotland. It's got very small windows. It's got big, thick walls. It's designed to be naturally ventilated and let the air in and to fuel the fire and keep a good supply of fresh air, but also to keep the users protected from the sort of harsher conditions outside. And then on the right-hand side is a completely different building in the east coast of England. It's a timber frame building, so it's not a stone construction. It's got larger windows, a much sort of lighter weight construction, and built for maybe a more milder, less harsh climate and location and a different purpose. And the map on the left-hand side just illustrates something that we talk about quite a bit, which is exposure, and particularly sort of wind-driven rain. So the areas in dark blue are the most exposed parts of the country, and perhaps have the most severe sort of wind and rain impacts, and the areas in the sort of lighter are the least exposed, so they're more sheltered. So depending on where you're located, you can sort of assess, how much exposure you have. And that also is not just sort of at a national level, but at a local level in terms of what's around you. Are you in an urban area with high buildings, or are you in sort of in a more rural or open town setting where there's lower buildings that provide less sort of shelter for your own sort of space? And, where is prevailing weather coming from, and how that sort of impacts your premises, and things like repair and maintenance, as well as energy efficiency.
Yes, this is trying to talk through that knowledge and that location bit in just a bit more detail, I guess. So, Robin was talking through the map earlier of buildings on the sort of southwest coast of England, but also up in the northwest of Scotland, and a lot of those buildings are a similar construction. So the image here that you can see on the top right of this slide, that could be a house in Bristol, it could be a house in West Wales, or it could be a house up in northwest Scotland. So a lot of our older buildings were sort of built with their local climate in mind, which is something we probably see less of these days with more modern buildings. But this is just trying to talk us through that we are in the UK, we are a little island that's very wet and very windy. So just because somebody has been doing things in Germany, for example, doesn't necessarily automatically make that a good idea for our climate. And we mentioned overheating a few times, and I just think it's interesting to look at the picture in the bottom right there that sort of talks through, or that sort of illustrates different considerations from countries with warmer climates. So the big, thick stone walls, lots of thermal mass, things like window shutters, things like shading and stuff like that. So it's also important to think about our climate and climate change in the way that it's probably not a good idea to be designing for past climate and past weather. We need to be increasingly thinking about designing for future climates. So that's what this is sort of trying to talk to.
So just to sort of take that a step further and think about how your local location and sort of national climate affects the construction of your building. And this is probably one of the things we'd urge you to just understand if you don't already sort of or aren't already aware of how your building is construction. Essentially, it's sort of split into two different types, and we loosely categorized as traditional versus modern. Traditional is broadly up until sort of the 1920s, and then modern from sort of 1920s onwards to current day. So on the left-hand side, the traditional building, it's designed the construction of the walls, for example, is designed to allow moisture to be absorbed externally and then to be evaporated when the conditions are right. And the same internally, it's designed to allow moisture to be absorbed and then evaporated when the conditions are right. And the same for the floor. The floor allows for evaporation, and it's generally always well ventilated through flues and windows, providing sort of good natural ventilation. But there's important the rain is protected from the rain by a good roof. It's got good guttering, but it has a sort of an internal moisture equilibrium that is sort of maintained through sort of subtle ebbs and flows of moisture in and out of the building fabric. And it requires the use of sort of permeable materials such as lime plaster or lime renders, lime mortars, and sensitive materials to make sure we don't trap sort of moisture in the fabric and actually exacerbate things. So on the right hand side, a completely different construction. This is a cavity wall. It's designed to keep any moisture out of the internal area, internal living space. There's a damp proof membrane under the concrete slab. There's an internal layer of blockwork. There is potential for condensation. However, we should have really good ventilation. For example, maybe trickle vents in the windows, or even better, some sort of mechanical extract ventilation for our bathrooms and kitchens. Or if we've got, depending on the use of the building, maybe even a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system. But the design of construction is to prevent the rain reaching or any moisture reaching the internal living space or occupied space. And it may penetrate through the outer skin, but it would drain down through the cavity and pop out at the water. Moisture would pop out at the bottom. So the external brickwork is sort of a rain screen that shields the rest of the building. So two different types of constructions. The one on the right hand side, can use all the sort of modern materials that you'd find at a typical builder's merchant, whereas the one on the left requires different materials and different sort of set of skills and knowledge to use those materials. So just something to bear in mind when you're thinking about different sort of fabric measures.
Hey, I appreciate that waterproofness is not necessarily a real word, but I guess it can get a bit tricky. So I'm trying to keep it simple here. So just building on from what Robin was just saying about traditional and modern fabric, I find it, if we look at our image on the left there, we've got our big grey coat, that's sort of representing our traditional building fabric. So if I was to go out in my big overcoat like that and it was to start raining, I would get a bit wet. If it was to rain heavily all day, I would probably get wet because it would probably soak through the fabric. But the idea is that once the rain stops and the sun comes out and the wind's blowing, my coat would be allowed to dry out through evaporation. And I would also be allowed to dry out because the moisture can move through the material. Whereas the image on the right there is representing a more modern building fabric that attempts to keep the water out. So if it was raining, I would stay dry unless there was a crack or a gap in my modern building fabric that would allow for moisture in, and then I would get wet inside the coat. And then even when it stopped raining, and even if the sun was shining and the wind was blowing, I would probably stay wet for quite a bit of time because evaporation can't now happen through that waterproof material. So it can be a bit tricky understanding some of the technical bits to waterproofness, but I guess for anybody that's looked at breathable socks or looked at running shoes or looks at tents or different things, yeah, it can be a bit fun, but that's just to get us thinking about that.
So just to kind of build on that and moving on from kind of, I suppose, the construction side, so thinking about what's going on inside the building, there's a concept called thermal comfort, which you may be familiar with. And this is a recognized term, and essentially it's a condition of the mind that expresses satisfaction with the environment. And to every person in a room, if you're all in the same room, will experience thermal comfort of that room differently. So one of the key things to just understanding what's relevant for your building and what measures could be most suitable is understanding the impacts of all the factors that go to make up thermal comfort of the occupants. So the image shows these sort of key factors, and these all impact our perception. So it's the radiant temperature of the surfaces, it's the level of activity of the users of the building, it's the humidity, is there sources of moisture, is there kitchens, is there shower rooms, bathrooms, is there lots of cooking taking place? Are people wearing appropriate, sort of levels of clothing? If it's a place of worship or a former church that's being used something else, then maybe, addressing what people are wearing and asking them to wear appropriate sort of layers to keep warm rather than having really high heating could be an option, for example. So that sort of ties in with air temperature and, of course, air speed. How quickly or slowly does air move through the space? All these kinds of things affect, whether people feel too hot, they feel comfortable, or too cold. I would add an additional one here as well, which is, and it may affect if you're sort of working in a sort of care setting, is actually how much food people have eaten. If they've eaten well and they're, not in a sort of perhaps a poverty situation, then that can also influence how they feel and the sort of level of comfort they feel and how warm they feel. So there's lots of different factors to sort of just consider and bear in mind when you're thinking about what is the most appropriate kind of work, measures, and what is actually most suitable for your space.
So we've got, I think we talk about understanding condition and repair and maintenance quite a lot. Apologies for that. But I guess it's, in our jobs, we notice that there are lots of issues, lots of existing issues in lots of buildings that do require attention, maybe before we're thinking about some of the shiny and new tech. So this is sort of a fairly common one. We've got a bit of a mold issue here. I think this one was caused by inadequate ventilation. Rainwater harvesting is a lovely idea, but unfortunately you see a lot of the time where there's been issues with how they've been plumbed in. So this was on my old house that my landlord had fitted, and it was leaking and it was causing a damp problem for my neighbour. So if you do have rainwater harvesting tanks, that's great, but please make sure they're not leaking. Damp problems come from mysterious places sometimes. This was one that I'd worked on in the past where they had a mysterious damp problem. It turns out that their water main was leaking. Chimneys are often a source of damp problems, whether that be open chimney pots from disused fireplaces that are going to be letting in rainwater, or it might be just the odd chimneys because they are quite exposed, quite high up, and quite tricky to visibly look at, but also to access. So they are often in a fairly poor condition and can often require attention. Rainwater gutters, I think we've touched on a couple of times, but it really is the most sort of basic form of trying to keep our walls dry, is ensuring that our rainwater grids are adequately sized, and particularly looking forward with climate change and increased intensity of rainfall. So it might be a case that we might need to be thinking about slightly larger gutters, but either way, they need to be working and in good order. And this picture here is just to sort of show that it's not just old buildings that have issues. So this building won some sort of architecture and sustainability design awards, but as you can sort of see, it's only a couple of years old and it's already got damp problems. And that's just a thermal image that might be a bit confusing actually, but the darker bit, we're sort of trying to show that there was actually a bit of a damp problem within the brickwork. So there are different things to think about. Double glazing is another one. This is where I guess things like EPCs are not always the most helpful. This is a property that I used to live in where the box had been ticked in terms of this house has double glazing, but what that didn't tell you is that even when the windows were closed, you could see daylight through them and air movement was happening. So whilst, yeah, it might have had nice double glazing, they were still really, really cold. So it's about looking closely at things like this.
So just sort of building on from those condition defects and those issues, it's also to understand if there's been any prior work. So has there been, for example, loft insulation installed? And I suppose also it's important to assess, has it been done appropriately? Is there any inappropriate work that might need to be removed before you can go ahead and do things in the right way? And for example, insulating loft space, which this image is an image of a loft space. So it's important just to understand, are the timbers ventilated, or is the insulation right up against the timbers, which can lead to moisture problems. So it's always important just to think about what exactly has been done in the past, and is it has it been effective, and is it doing the job it's supposed to be. This one here, some cement pointing in part of the wall. There's lots of gaps around it, but cement pointing in this old building is not the right approach. It will trap moisture. It could cause the stone to crack and decay. The stone is probably softer than the cement, so the stone will be the thing that gives away and is impacted by the weather before the cement. The cement might end up being sort of proud of the surrounding stone over a period of sort of a long time. So this is just a sort of an example to make sure the right materials are used for the fabric. And here, I think we're looking at some render and some waterproof paint that's been applied to an old building. So this will be trapping moisture in the wall, which needs to go somewhere. It's trying to dry out, so it may try and sort of permeate into the inside space. And again, people think, oh no, I've got a damp problem. Actually, it's just the wall trying to do what it was designed to do naturally and just absorb and release moisture, but it's being trapped on the outside by a waterproof cement render with a modern paint. And then here, again, there's some render issues. We've got modern paint's been applied to the outside of the building. We can see cracks in the render. We can see the paint peeling off below one of the bay windows. So again, just an illustration of to be mindful of the right materials for the building. And then here again, a very similar thing. I think this is internally a gap between some render or plasterboard and again some an old traditional stone construction and gypsum plaster, which again is not the right sort of material to use for this construction. Yeah, I think this was yours.
Sorry, these are a collection of photos from over the years. I guess dealing with damp problems, I think we touched on it in the last session, but it's really important to try and understand the underlying causes of damp problems. And over the years, there's been lots of people selling remedies for damp problems. And this was an interesting one that I came across where rather than understanding the underlying cause of the damp-proof problem, somebody had sold a system where you essentially drilled in various holes around the building and had a metal wire that was running around the building with a small electrical charge going through it. Needless to say, and to cut a long story short, it didn't solve the damp problem, but I suppose it's just being mindful of understanding any existing issues and understanding the cause of those issues. So we talk about retrofit and trying to make our buildings more energy efficient. Occasionally that does mean we might need to undo somebody else's past intervention.
And I think this image just illustrates we've got a downpipe which drains onto tarmac, which is up against the wall of an old stone building. So whilst this is sort of the rainwater pipe is doing the right thing, obviously when the water hits the tarmac, it potentially just sits there. It doesn't look like there's a good sort of runoff for the water. Ideally, it should be going straight into a drain. So that tarmac will trap moisture. It potentially will send it towards the wall, which will make the wall more damp, which will make the wall colder, which will leave the wall, then essentially a wet wall loses more heat than a dry wall. So there's lots of different factors and issues that can come from a simple downpipe that drains onto an impermeable surface outside a stone wall. And I think there's one more image. Okay, this is a really interesting one. And I suppose this is how not to have external wall insulation installed. Just very briefly, there's, as you may see, if you look at the area around the boiler flue, which is sort of top middle of the picture, there's sort of an indented space where the insulation is missing. So this will be what we call a thermal bridge. So that area will be a much colder piece of wall. Again, there's a similar thing where they boxed round the external entry point for the external soil pipe, and then there's other little places around window sills and window reveals, all of which will be cold bridges. I think there may be an issue at the top under the guttering and a little ledge which is being created, which will help moisture to enter potentially behind the insulation that could cause lots of trapped moisture problems behind the insulation. So really not a good example of external wall insulation.
I think this is just backing up that point about trying to understand your different spaces. One of the things we always try and encourage groups to do, if they don't already have some way of tracking what different spaces are used for and when, it can be really helpful, even with simple things like setting heating programs. It might also be helpful for looking at when your building is not used, how you might be able to attract more users. But yeah, it's just the more information you can have and the more informed decisions you can make. I guess that's the point.
So just to want to now touch on a few different things away from the building fabric and surrounding issues, but just sort of other aspects that you maybe need to grapple with. One of them, of course, being planning permission. It might be necessary for you to seek planning permission or consent from a local authority for your retrofit work. So just to be aware, some things are classed as permitted development and won't need it, whereas some things will. And then, of course, if you've got a heritage property, ideally you should know if it's listed or in a conservation area, in which case particular, sort of consent will be needed. There are other consents. Probably, I'm guessing you may not have a scheduled monument or be located in a park. However, there is something called ecclesiastical exemption, which is your active place of worship. Also, different other sort of consents just to be aware of.
Yeah, and I guess just to try and simplify that a little bit. So if you are looking at heritage consents, there's a bit of a table there which sort of talks through when you might need consent. I guess the simple advice is, if you're not sure, check. Again, Historic England's website has lots of good guidance around when you might need permission and what that process looks like. The only other thing I would mention, because I don't think it was on the last slide, is there is such a thing as a locally listed building or a local list. So that's where you might have a building that might not be of national significance and be nationally listed and protected. Different councils do have lists of local buildings that they think are quite important locally, that might have different protections locally, but you will have to check local council websites for that sort of stuff.
So just to sort of wrap up a few points here and sort of lead us also onto the next couple of slides. We'll talk a little bit about payback in a second and how that's calculated, and it might be something that's on some of your minds, but this really does depend on lots of different things. And of course, we've talked about how the building is used, where it's located, how the heating system is set up. So there's lots of, I suppose, just to remember, there's lots of different aspects that influence payback. And also, we talked at the very beginning, very briefly, about embodied carbon and whole life carbon. And you may be aware that in some cases, there's different calculations that people might talk about, and the carbon impact of the retrofit measures. and whether, depending on the cost and the carbon impact, whether actually it might be more carbon emissions might be emitted rather than saved. And it's really difficult actually to give an accurate assessment of embodied carbon. And just I suppose to be aware that many energy efficiency measures may not realize much in the way of carbon savings over their lifespan. So it depends on what kind of criteria you're looking for and what's your measure of success. I'm guessing probably most of you it's some sort of energy efficiency, energy cost reduction, and maybe carbon, maybe a second to that. But just to think about what measures you're having done and the carbon savings that may be realistic from that. And multiple interventions, they're not cumulative. So I suppose it can be deceiving. They're kind of interdependent. So it's not like you can add all the measures together and have a total, potential financial or carbon saving. They all sort of will have some form of interdependency. So it's just to be aware of those kind of things, and also take a holistic view and think about health and well-being and comfort and safety, as well as just purely energy efficiency. So what will make your building more comfortable? What will help the well-being and health of the users, if that's a factor? And then one thing we've talked quite a bit about, and I unfortunately mention it again, is the repair and maintenance. It's quite difficult to calculate any savings from taking repair and maintenance, but what we would say is actually it's quite fundamental to the longevity of the building. It helps to maintain the building's viability and also the value of the building as well. If things are well maintained, then they'll function as normal. But if they're not well maintained, then issues can occur, and it can cause unnecessary cost in getting those issues repaired. And then, of course, we talked briefly just about listed buildings and heritage properties. It's actually, we should say it's just a criminal offence to carry out works on a listed building without having the relevant permission and consent in place.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to talk all the way through this, but if anybody isn't aware, the HSE have a few simple sort of checklists and stuff for people to look through. So just flagging that. If you have a look on the website, you'll probably find it might be helpful.
So just going to touch very briefly on how to calculate a simple payback or sort of break even. So this refers to the time it will take you to make operational savings that equal the initial investment in your installed measures or the retrofit work you've done. So it's the total initial investment divided by your annual savings gives you the payback period in years. And there's a few things just to think about, the kind of factors that influence this. It's not necessarily just about the financial, performance. It's other factors involving energy. There's rising energy costs. There's the availability of grants and tariffs. There's maintenance and servicing costs, replacement costs associated with these measures if things come to the end of their life and might need to be repaired or replaced. There's the cost of the borrowing money in the first place. But also in the longer term, there's the benefit of lower energy in the building for any future tenants or occupants. And also we need to just think about the occupants' behaviour change. If you're in a building where the heating's always been sort of put down quite low in order to save money, people may have compensated by wearing an extra layer of clothing. If suddenly the building is a nice warm space, then that behaviour may change. So the heating average temperature may rise because people think, oh, look, I'm opportunity to be warmer and more comfortable. So actually, there may be a sort of a rebound effect where the heating ends up being higher than actually what you might anticipate, which would increase the energy consumption maybe beyond what you might expect. So I suppose it's just a flag. There's lots of different factors that involve what typical return might be and what payback might be expected.
Hey, just quickly, I guess, skills and experience. So if you are looking to find people, ask around. particularly if you've got a traditional building or a heritage building. You're going to need people that are specifically trained to work on those sorts of buildings. It's always a good idea to ask around, ask them about training and qualifications, but also where possible, have a look at some of the other jobs that people have done. You can check for references. You can go and have a look at their past works. Yeah.
So just to say, of course, a few things to bear in mind when getting quotes is 3 quotes are ideal. Have people been to site? Are they suitably trained? Do they have insurances that work guaranteed? Lots of sort of key points. And then we're just going to finish here with, and this will be in the slides that will come round to you, some examples of what you should think about for different types of contractor. So mechanical engineer, a renewable energy installer, and electrical contractor. It's just the kind of things to think about and the kind of qualifications and experience you should be looking for. So that's us. I'm just going to stop sharing. Here, 1 second.
Thanks both. That was really interesting. I appreciate we've run slightly over. We do have one question in the Q&A box, and that is, does higher humidity for a given temperature mean that people might perceive it as colder?
It depends, which unfortunately is an answer to lots of questions. It depends on that given temperature. If that temperature is quite low and the humidity is high, it can feel colder. If that temperature is high and it's quite humid, it can feel quite oppressive. So it depends on what that temperature is.
Yeah, and I guess just on that, the amount of moisture that the air can hold changes at different temperatures. So if you've got warmer air, the air can hold more moisture. Whereas if you've got a lower temperature, you might then have more moisture problems, damp problems, that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, sorry if that doesn't answer it.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I do appreciate we've run over time for people. Just to let you know, I hope you find that useful. We do have some further sessions coming up, so please do sign up to those if you're interested, and they will be accompanied by live case studies of people who have secured ERF funding. Thank you very much for your time. As I said at the start, slides will be sent out and will be shared on our website, the recordings and everything. If you do have any specific questions, please do feel free to get in touch with ourselves or with CSE. Thank you very much for your time. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.